Who is the wisest one in the room? It can be you. You can become the wisest one in the room with some help from this book, The Wisest One in the Room by Gilovich and Ross. Hi, my name is Chris Gibson, and I want to share with you a book review of The Wisest One in the Room. It's a social psychology book written for a general audience. Now, last book review, I reviewed Elliot Aronson's Not by Chance Alone, which introduces social psychology from within his autobiography. I love the way that book's written. I love what it does. And it just gives you this insider perspective of doing social psychological research, of being a university professor, and so many things in that book. It's a wonderful book. And I'll put the link in the description below to that book review. I wanted to do another book that is an introduction to social psychology. Except this time I wanted to do one from a different perspective, because I thought doing one from a different perspective, that would kind of fill in the gaps for those who don't relate well to like Aronson's approach in his book. So Thomas Gilovich and Lee Ross make it the aim of this book to help us to become wiser. Yet, that's not the highest aim. The higher aim is to help us to understand why. The authors say this. They say, to him, speaking of Aristotle, a knowledgeable person knows a lot about what and how, but a wise person understands why. And so this is an important statement. We want to understand why. We want to be wise. How does this work in a social psychology book? Well, in section 1, they teach the broad, tested, tried, and true principles of social psychology. And then in section 2, they apply those principles to practical problems. We find true wisdom in taking those principles and applying them, not just learning them, but putting them to use in various situations individually, as a country, and even on the world level. And there's certainly a lot of applications for these principles that they show us. Now, in the comments below, if you have an interest in social psychology, tell me why. Tell me why you might be interested in this book, in this review. And I would just like to hear from you. What is your interest in social psychology? So how do they go about this? Well, they go about this first in section 1, covering the pillars of wisdom. This is chapters 1 through 5. And so just beginning with chapter 1, here they consider what's called naive realism and the false consensus effect. We tend to think that we perceive things the way that they are, and that those who disagree with us do not perceive things the way they are. And I think this is a very interesting principle that we find in social psychology. We also tend to think that everyone agrees with us. And frankly, I get irritated at others, and I get irritated at myself when I realize that these assumptions are happening in this way, that they're just assuming I agree with them about something and that everybody else does, even if I don't. And probably not as many people agree with them as they think agree with them. And admittedly, I do this as well myself, so I have to give some grace there. But it really is interesting how we do this. The other thing is, we can help ourselves. We can help ourselves by talking to others, by listening and getting their opinions, so that we don't make these mistakes as much. Now, chapter 2 continues. It continues by discussing the foot in the door technique, the opt-in, opt-out strategies, Kurt Lewin and a key idea that he had, Stanley Milgram's authority research, and also the fundamental attribution error. Now, these are all commonly discussed in social psychology. For me, I found that the discussion on Kurt Lewin, the father of American social psychology, was particularly interesting. At the college level, I've taught social psychology courses, but I really never fully understood the significance of Lewin until reading this book. I like this quote by Lewin. Lewin famously said, "There's nothing as practical as a good theory." And I hope you get the irony for that. So often we think, well, theory is just theory. It has no practical meaning or application. But the irony there is theory can be very helpful. And so when it comes to behavioral change, Lewin suggested identifying and eliminating the obstacles standing in the way of desired behavior. And what we found is with the opt-in, opt-out studies and other studies in social psychology that Lewin's correct. The easier path we make it for people, the more likely you're going to get the desired behavioral change. And so I found that interesting in Chapter 2. Chapter 3 discusses other generally accepted principles from social psychology. Some things that are discussed there are things such as framing. How do you frame things? Labeling. The prisoner's dilemma. There's more about the opt-in, opt-out strategies and studies. Priming. Schemas. Motivation. The above-average effect. Now, continuing in the Lewin train of thought, opt-in does not work as well as opt-out. In Chapter 2, they studied organ donation as well as participating in retirement plans. If someone is automatically an organ donor, which is true for some countries, or they're automatically participating in a retirement program unless they opt out, they're more likely to remain in the program. If someone has to opt in to become an organ donor, or they have to opt in to participate in a retirement program, then they're less likely to do it. Much more is covered in these chapters, but they're just so jam-packed with social psychological studies and findings, things that's been supported over and over and over in social psychology, that I really can't mention them all in this review. Chapter 4 continues to discuss important findings. Now I'll just focus on one primary finding here that I want to mention, but there's a lot of other findings included in the chapter. What they found is feelings influence behavior and behavior influence feelings. Now there's something to this statement, and you've probably heard this statement before. Fake it till you make it. Well, we can change our behavior, our feelings and thoughts by changing one of these. If you address the behavior, feelings, and thoughts, then you can change the other by changing one of those. So really, according to social psychology, there's probably not one single therapeutic approach that's effective. Multiple approaches could be effective. If you can change that one, then the other two things for the person will also probably change. Now, there is a caveat that I just have to mention. While behavior predicts attitudes and thoughts, attitudes do not tend to predict behavior. And that was an interesting finding that the book discusses further in this chapter. But there's several counterintuitive findings that are discussed. For instance, it seems intuitive to think that if you do what you love, then you'll love what you do. As a matter of fact, that's pretty common career advice for many young people. Figure out what you love and do it and get paid for it. Do it so well that you get paid for it is the kind of career advice that often young people are given. Unfortunately, if you get paid well to do it, it tends to reduce your enjoyment of the activity. And so it's kind of paradoxical there. So a person in this situation must remind themselves why they're doing it. What's their purpose? What's their focus? Why did they start doing this to begin with? And then chapter 5 considers several other important concepts as well. Let me address one of those. Once again, the chapters are just jam-packed with social psych findings and research, and then they group them together with the main focus of the chapter. Let me mention another one of those from chapter 5. Daniel Kahneman writes in Thinking Fast and Slow about two types of thinking, fast and slow thinking. Fast thinking is intuitive. Slow thinking is rational. And so Here, understanding how these two types of thinking interact can be helpful in reducing what's called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias means that we look for evidence to support our thinking and we ignore counter evidence. So instead of looking for support, this is a suggestion, instead of just looking for support for our position, we need to look for evidence to disprove our initial impression. And in science, as we do research in various areas, that's one of the things you do now. You do a hypothesis and a null hypothesis. So another way of saying this is we need to be our own devil's advocate, or ask someone else to be a devil's advocate to challenge our thinking, to help us to see evidence that disproves what we're thinking and our theory about something. So I think this is helpful as well in chapter 5, and I will include a link to Daniel Kahneman's book down in the description below. How do we apply this wisdom? How do we apply this wisdom? Well, many more social psychological principles are covered in these chapters than I can even mention. I've already said this, but we move on to the next section, which is wisdom applied. And so in the next section, they seek to apply these social psychological principles in practical ways. The first way they do that is the pursuit of happiness. Now, here's a couple of ideas. If we spend more time on experiences than possessions, then we're probably going to be happier. Possessions do not enhance happiness, but experiences do enhance happiness. So we need to choose quality over quantity. When it comes to a vacation, choose to stay at a better place. You may have a shorter stay, but the experience overall is going to be better. And then you also want to end with a peak experience. Maybe that one thing that you wanted to make sure you do on your trip, you save it until that last day or two, and then you end with that. You enjoy the week, you build up to it, but you end with that peak experience. Because if you end with that peak experience, you're going to have a better memory of the trip. You're going to enjoy it more. It's going to contribute to your happiness more. Chapter 7 goes on and applies psychological principles to negotiations. When negotiations are going on, there's psychological barriers that exist which will hinder the negotiations. Recognizing and skillfully dealing with these barriers can make or break the negotiations. This chapter helps us to understand and work through those barriers. It's a great chapter, especially if you're thinking about bringing two parties together in some way. Chapter 8 deals with education in America, understanding the student mindset, problems, and interventions which can improve a student's educational performance. In this chapter, they discuss Carol Dweck's mindset work. Now, Carol Dweck has done a lot of research in this area, and she's determined there's two main mindsets. There's a fixed mindset where if you don't know it, you tend to give up, or a growth mindset. If you don't know it or you didn't do well at it, you see it as a challenge and you want to overcome it. And there's more to it than that, and they cover a lot of this in this chapter and how they're creating interventions to help people develop a growth mindset. That if they fail a test or fail at something, they don't attribute it to them not being able to learn. They attribute it to lacking in hard work and not putting in the hard work to learn it and to be able to grow. And so a growth mindset makes a huge difference. And several interventions have been developed to help students develop that growth mindset and to do well academically. Chapter 9 deals with the problem of climate change. They apply Robert Cialdini's work and influence, his book Influence, to the issue of climate change. Now, Cialdini's work is mentioned multiple times in this book, but here they actually try to apply it to a real-world issue that is going on. Cialdini's book Influence has been this huge bestseller, any person in business or sales or even in academics need to read the book Influence. And so I am going to link it as well down below, and it's one of those books that I also want to review in the future because it's been such an influential book over the years. Incredible research that he did there and wrote it in a popular fashion. So several psychologically oriented issues make it difficult to change people's mind when it comes to climate change. And so 3 ways are given to help change people's mind when it comes to this important issue. And so it's built on Robert Cialdini's work, and you see how his work can be applied to an issue like this, at least on a small scale, and it shows promise. It shows promise. The wisest one in the room is just packed with well-supported social psychological principles. This is a great introduction to the overall field of social psychology, and I recommend it for those who are interested in social psychology. You might be a student who's studying social psychology, or you might be interested in studying social psychology. If you are, get this book and read it along with the Aronson book. Both are great starter books for social psychology. Or you just may be a layperson and you're interested in the principles and potential applications in various settings of social psychology. This book will get you started in understanding the basic principles of social psychology, as well as applying them in various areas. If you're a teacher, if you work in resolving conflict in your context, there's so many practical applications. This can be helpful for you. So if you have a bookstore that you frequent, please support your local bookstore. I know a lot of local bookstores are struggling these days. But if you do decide to purchase it and you typically order your books through Amazon, please consider using my affiliate links below. I'm including links to this book, The Wisest One in the Room, as well as links to the books I've mentioned that they referred to heavily in this book. And I'm going to leave those in the description below. And if you want to use them, please consider that. If not, no problem. I hope this review was interesting to you. And I just want to say, thank you for checking out this book review. If you'd like to know when new content is published on this channel, please consider clicking on the red subscribe button. Also, I hope if you did like the video, you'll consider giving me a thumbs up and sharing this video to others who might be interested in it. I hope to regularly publish book reviews on this channel, especially in the area of social psychology, but also in other areas of psychology as well. So once again, thank you for checking out this book review. My name's Chris Gibson, and there's more to come.